everyone, and thanks for joining this virtual talk at Google. I'm Danielle Perzik, a researcher here at Google, and today I'm with Professor Cassie Holmes to discuss her new book, Happier Hour: How to Beat Distraction, Expand Your Time, and Focus on What Matters Most. Dr. Holmes is a professor at UCLA's Anderson School of Management, where she's an award-winning teacher and researcher. The basis for her book came from a very popular MBA class that she teaches on how to improve our lives by changing how we perceive and invest our time. Her work on the intersection of time and happiness has been widely published in lead academic journals and featured in such outlets as NPR, The Economist, The New York Times, The Wall Street Journal, The Atlantic, The Washington Post, and more. With that, let's welcome Professor Holmes. I'm going to begin the conversation by asking some questions about the book, and then I will open it up to questions from the audience. So, Professor Holmes, thank you so much for being with us here today. Your book is a fantastic guide on how we can proactively improve our well-being. But I should say, I really wouldn't categorize it as a self-help book because every recommendation you make is backed by rigorous scientific research on happiness, including your own work in the field of social psychology. Now, the science of happiness is a relatively new field that's been gaining a lot of attention in recent years. Can you get us started by defining what happiness is, according to scientists, as well as how they measure it and why it matters?
Yeah, well, hello. And I am so happy to be here. And by happy, I mean, in psychology, we refer to it as subjective well-being. And it's basically how positive as opposed to negative we feel in the day-to-day, in the moment, as well as there's an evaluative cognitive component of how satisfied we feel about our lives overall. And so when I'm using the term happiness, it's that coupling of both how you're feeling now during it, as well as how you feel about it. And it is absolutely important. I mean, here we are talking in a business context, but it is really important in our lives. Sort of overall research shows that when people feel happy, it shows up, has positive consequences across our domains in the workplace, in our interpersonal relationships with respect to health. Just as some examples in these findings, when people are happy, they are more motivated. They're more adaptive in our problem solving. When we're happy, we are more creative. We are, with respect to our interpersonal relationships, we like others more when we feel happy. We are liked by others more when we feel happy. We are nicer. We're more willing to help others out. Also, with respect to health, happiness increases our immune functioning. It increases our thresholds for pain. It's correlational, but happy people live longer. And so not only do we sort of want to feel happy, that there is reason to want to sort of take care of our emotional well-being. And it's funny because I've been studying throughout my career happiness and focusing on the role of time. And before the pandemic, I used to have to motivate happiness. Like I would have the slides, which including some of the research that I just shared with you of like why it's important. But I actually think that the last couple of years have taught us that we absolutely can't take our emotional well-being for granted. I mean, we see anxiety rates have increased, depression rates, loneliness. And so all of that has shown all of us just how important it is that we take care of our emotional well-being.
Right. And the fact that all of these different health metrics correlate reliably with the subjective measures that psychologists use really validate that the construct is a real thing.
Yeah.
Asking people about how they feel is meaningful.
It is meaningful. It correlates with our sort of physiological well-being. It also correlates, as you would expect, with our circumstantial factors. That is, if you're in a setting that one would imagine would contribute to greater happiness, you see it increasing. But so yes, it is a real thing. It does absolutely matter. And what matters and is what we're measuring is how do you feel? How do you feel about X, your life, your day? It's absolutely important.
Right. So if we want to be happy in the modern world, if we want to feel good, then we're up against at least two big challenges beyond the circumstances that we've all recently sort of been through. One is an evolutionary challenge, the other is a cultural challenge. So the first is that the human mind really didn't evolve to be happy. It evolved to help us survive. And often what that looks like is anxious patterns of thought. Some people are, of course, born more dispositionally happy than others, but we all benefit from an understanding of how our mind works so that we can nudge it towards these more healthy patterns of thought. And then this cultural challenge is that, as you point out in your book, we live in a culture driven toward productivity, so much so that busyness has become a status symbol that is taken to signal an individual's worth. It's quoted from your book. And I'm sure that this statement resonates with a lot of people who are listening today. The statistics as well show that the larger population, in fact, does feel time poor, as you call it. Can you recount the story that you opened your book with about your own struggle on this front and how it led you to where you are now?
Yes, absolutely. And I, reflecting back, and there was this sort of poignant evening. It was when I was on the faculty at Wharton. And so I was living in Philly at the time. And I remember this day, I had gone up to New York to give a talk on my research. And that talk was sort of sandwiched into back-to-back meetings. And then I'm rushing to a colleague dinner and then rushing to the train to get the very last train that would get me home to my 4-month-old and my husband. And I am dispositionally more of a happy person, so I don't yell, but like cab drivers in New York drive fast. And he was driving fast and I was still like yelling. I'm like, hurry up. I can't miss this train. And I didn't. I made the train, but I remember sitting and looking out the window as the sort of dark blur of houses and trees whizzed by. And I was like, gosh, things are moving so fast. Time is moving so fast. And I felt like, I don't know if I can keep up. I was exhausted, totally overwhelmed, with the pressures of work, wanting to be a good parent, wanting to be a good partner, wanting to be a good friend, and the never ending pile of chores that, are waiting for me at home. And I was like, not only do I not have enough time to do it, I can't do any of it well. Mm-hmm. I don't have time to enjoy any of it along the way. And in that moment, I was just like, what? Maybe I just can't do it. And maybe I should quit my job that I'd worked so hard for. But if only I had a whole lot more hours in my day, then surely I'd be happier, right? And I went on to test that. So I didn't quit, but I went on to test that to look at, would I be happier if I had a whole lot more time? So with some of my favorite collaborators, Hal Hirschfield and Marissa Sharif, we tested what's the relationship between the amount of discretionary time folks have and their satisfaction in life. And what we saw, so we analyzed, among other studies, we analyzed data from the American Time Use Survey, which captures for tens of thousands working and non-working Americans, how they spend a particular regular day. And with that, we calculated how much time they spend on discretionary activities, which using sort of other data, we identified as that was sort of doing nothing, sort of relaxing, passive leisure. Active leisure, so exercising, playing sports, going to sporting events, as well as spending time with family and friends. And the relationship that we saw, the pattern, was interesting. So it was an inverted U shape, so like an arc or a rainbow. And what that suggests is that, yes, on one end, which was representing me on the train that night, and I'm sure many of you can identify with, yes, having too little discretionary time in our day is associated with less happiness, and that's because we feel greater stress. But what was interesting, and this was in this data, it was less than approximately 2 hours of discretionary time in the day. But what we also saw on the other end, that was the surprising part, where people with too much discretionary time or there was such thing as too much discretionary time, because you saw lower levels of satisfaction among them. And our analyses and additional studies suggest that that is driven by the fact that when we are spending our sort of days with nothing to show for how we spent those hours, then we feel less productive. And this undermines our sense of purpose, and therefore we feel dissatisfied. And so this is interesting because it told me I shouldn't quit my job, because for me, my job is actually a great sense of purpose. And so not to quit my job. And it also suggested that except at those extremes, there's a pretty wide range where it's not about how much time you have. And that leaves open this question of like, okay, if it's not about how much, then it's really about how you spend and invest the time that you have. And that led to me to sort of shift my research a bit to answer, like, how should we be spending our time for greater happiness, for greater fulfillment? And from those learnings, I developed this course that I've been teaching to our MBAs and our executive MBAs, applying the science of happiness to life design. And it is all these tools that are in Happier Hour and the strategies that are based, as you noted, on research, so that folks can apply them to. It's really about spending more time on activities that feel worthwhile and minimizing the time on activities that feel wasteful.
And I think that's a really important finding, because it's counterintuitive, right? Those of us who have been maybe close to burnout before, we think more is more when we're starved of time. The only thing we can think about is wanting more free time, but in fact, that wouldn't be a good thing for us. So
it is counterintuitive, except actually among those you see among retirees, actually, when for folks who don't have activities in their day that feel impactful or worthwhile, then you actually see reduced levels of depression or increased levels of depression. But those retirees who do volunteer work, for instance, you see actually increased amounts of satisfaction. And also, I think it is important to point out in our data even that it wasn't just about the amount of discretionary and having a lot, because for folks who spent their discretionary time on worthwhile activities that they felt were enriching, so an enriching hobby, or doing sports that felt sort of purposeful and productive, or spending time connecting with others, you actually didn't see this dip. It didn't go down. That it wasn't, but it wasn't actually more is more. Except actually among social connections. So there isn't, it's not like you can be too happy in the relationships that you have. But you did see that it's about spending both your discretionary time and your non-discretionary time in ways that are worthwhile. That's the goal. And that's what we can talk about, because that's the secret.
So one of the through lines of the modern science of the mind is that people have far less control or agency than they think that they do. We're a product of our genes and our environments, and there's very little wiggle room for us to steer the ship, so to speak. And happiness is no different. As you write in your book, we genetically vary in our predispositions to be happy, as we do for all traits. You are one of the lucky ones. Now, the flow of time, even more than our genes and our environment, is perhaps the most immutable of things. But you argue that we can actually take charge here, because we can control, at least in part, how we perceive time. And it's this perception of time that really matters. And kind of hinted at this in your last answer. But what do you mean by how we can influence our perception of time, how we can kind of hack our mind so that we feel like we are more time rich?
Yeah. And really, it's so that we feel less limited by time as a resource. And we can sort of circle back to this, but I absolutely think it's so important to recognize that we actually do have agency in our happiness. And this is the route towards that. We don't have control over our natural disposition. We don't have a ton of control over our life circumstances, but we do have some say in how we spend the hours of our day. But to answer your question about time perception, so when I defined being time poor, it's the feeling of having too much to do and not enough time to do it. That's that limited sense, right? We are constrained because there are things that we think we should be doing and could be doing, and in some cases want to be doing, and without the ability to do all of those things. And there are some inputs into like our sense of what we could and should be doing. Unfortunately, my hypothesis is that sort of technology messes with this because, we have our really smart smartphones, which are so helpful in so many ways. But we also have to be aware of the impact of our sort of sense of our expectations of what we should and could be doing, because through social media, at all moments, if you're looking at other people's, curated, smiley-filled moments, that there are always other things that you are recognizing you could be doing. Like, wouldn't it be so great? And I am not, since I'm on my couch, or desk, looking at them having that great time, then, you are clearly not spending your time in that moment at that second in the best way. But you actually very well could be. All to say that it's like this idea of like what we could be doing at any moment, as well as what we should. So our technology allows us to be very effective on the move. Like we can, crank through our to-do lists, on our phones. And so it's very easy to never, because we always can be doing something, we feel like we always should be doing something. And of course, there are not enough hours in like lifetimes to do all of those things that we could, like all of the shows, all of the TED Talks, all of the, movies, less like classes that we have available to us at our fingertips. So there's not enough time to do all of that. So the question is recognizing that our expectations of what we can and should be doing, and it should actually be driven instead of these nebulous notions of what is possible to actually what matters to you. So that's one side of it. And it's the sense of efficacy of being able to accomplish what you do set out to do. And so in our research, we find that actually if you spend time on activities that increase your sense of being able to do what you set out to do, lessening that sense of limitation. So an example is exercise. So exercise is actually, so when, and I can ask, in your head, complete this sentence. I don't have time to. And I ask folks to complete that sentence. I don't have time to. The stuff that people say they don't have time to do, it's a lot. It's like these really basic things like exercise, like brushing, flossing. People do brush their teeth, but I don't have time to floss is what I hear, or, wash my hair. But the other thing that people don't say they have time to do is to exercise or to read for pleasure. But exercise is one of these activities that when you do them, it increases, research shows, it increases your sense of self. It increases your self-esteem. It's a mood booster. It's actually also shown to increase your cognitive functioning. And I can say as personally, I love to go for runs in the morning. And that, when I'm not following my advice and research, is something that I don't do because I'm like, I don't have time. But when I make the time on that run, it's like all of a sudden, like the day feels so approachable and able. And like running, I'm like, yes, like I can do today. Like it lessens that sense of limitation, as does spending time for others. So through helping others, when we feel time poor, we become stingy with our time and we're less likely to take the time to help others. But we have work that shows that actually those who give time feel like they have more time. And it is driven through that sense of self-efficacy. Once you've helped someone, you're like, oh my gosh, I accomplished a lot with my time. And it gives you a recognition of just how much you can accomplish with your time more generally. Another way to increase your sense of time affluence is by exposing yourself to an experience that elicits awe. Oftentimes that comes from being outside in nature. It can come from exposing yourself to like a feat, like an incredible feat that someone, like whether artistically or athletically, or like seeing what our humans are able to accomplish is really awe-inspiring. And research shows that when people experience awe, by increasing and expanding their perspective, it also expands their sense of time.
So it's as if there are these things that we can choose to spend time doing that actually pay us dividends. They're investments that give us more in our perception.
Absolutely.
You also bring up that we should take vacations if we can, or at least treat our weekends like vacations, and that can make us feel like we have more time and that our time can be restorative in a way that really helps us throughout our week.
Yeah, and this is a really practical intervention and useful, and I continue to use it and apply it. And it's based off of this sort of observation that actually us as Americans, we are really bad at taking vacation. But research shows that taking vacation is associated with greater creativity, greater engagement with your work, greater satisfaction. And so we don't take breaks because, yes, vacations are expensive, but the bigger sort of impulse is that we don't feel like we have time to take these breaks. So when I tell you this intervention, I don't want to suggest don't take time for vacation, because vacations are important. In addition to that, recognizing that we do have breaks from work during our weeks. So most Americans get 2 days off on the weekends every week. But oftentimes we don't treat those or experience those like the true breaks that they are, because we're sort of continuing through our to-do lists and oftentimes sort of pulling work into our weekends and always continuing to feel on and in this sort of doing mode. But we ran experiments among working professionals leading into a regular weekend, and we randomly assigned half of them. We gave them a simple instructions: treat this weekend like a vacation. And we assigned the other folks in the control condition: treat this weekend like a regular weekend. On Monday, we reconnected with the participants, measured their happiness again, and we found that those who had treated the weekend like a vacation were happier. And they also, in additional studies, we found that they enjoyed the weekend more. And interestingly, we looked at sort of what's driving this. We looked at how are they spending their time on the weekends. And you do see some minor differences, but not big ones. It's not like, so you do see that those who treat their weekend like a vacation do spend a little bit less time doing work, and they spend a little less time doing housework. They spend more time at the kitchen table, or not the kitchen table. They spend more time eating. So at a table, presumably. And they spend a little bit more time in bed in intimate relations. So sort of like vacation, but it's not like they spent no time doing work or no time doing housework. So, and interestingly, the way they spent their time on their weekend wasn't the significant predictor of their happiness when they returned to work on Monday. What was their mindset. So those who treated their weekend like a vacation were more engaged. They were more present during their activities. So you can sort of think about this. We didn't tell, like, our participants could treat the weekend like a vacation however they wanted. But apparently what vacation means to us is a break. It allows us to sort of, instead of all the doing, it allows us to be in whatever we are doing. And so from that increased attention to the present, engagement with our activities, then people enjoyed their breaks more, and they were happier when they returned to work. Now, a question that you guys might be wondering, is like, well, I have chores to do. Like, when am I going to do that stuff that I like save for the weekend that I do have to do? And it's like, yes, we have chores to do. The thing is that what you should do is sort of carve out and partition, if it is a part of the weekend, just a couple hours, that's where you're going to get your stuff done. But very clearly, the other time in the weekend is like a vacation. So you do get that break, as opposed to like throughout the weekend being like, oh yeah, I'm meant to be doing something. No, you should be taking the break that you deserve. Or you can be really strategic and like shift all your chores to somewhere, one evening during the week, and you get it all done and out of the way, so that your weekend is available to treat like a vacation.
And this gets a little bit at the idea of ritual. So if you kind of ritualize your time off and think of it as a vacation, but the power of ritual goes so much further than that. And you use that as another sort of hack. If you treat things as rituals, it can pay dividends. Can you talk a little bit about the power of ritual?
Yeah. And it is just like our weekends, we are in this routine where we're not thinking and we're in doing mode. And what routine? So one of the strategies to sort of make more of our time, not in terms of productivity, but to enjoy greater happiness with the time we spend, is to turn routines into rituals. And the example that I use or that I share in Happier Hour is my coffee dates with my daughter. She is now 7. And this actually started from a very functional routine where I was in charge of her older brother's carpool drop off on Thursday mornings. And then she was in nursery school right next to my office. And so on the way after dropping the big kids off, I would stop at the coffee shop to get my caffeine fix. And she started tagging along. But we changed that. Instead of being at like a functional coffee stop and part of our routine, we turned it into a ritual. And this became our sort of treasured special 30 minutes each week, where it was just about she and I being together. Mm-hmm. And it was, we'd order our special thing. I have my flat white, she gets her hot chocolate, we have our croissants, and we are just totally in it. And we like named it. And actually now she's also at school. It's called the Thursday morning coffee date. Now it's on Sunday mornings, but we gave it a name. We listened to the same songs as we're on our way there. And what's really meaningful and impactful about it's just 30 minutes, but it's 30 minutes that we anticipate, we look forward to during the week. And while we're in it, we're like, my cell phone is away. I'm like, my to-do list that's in my head is quieted. And so it's in it, like while we're spending the time, it's very impactful and we are present and engaged and treasuring it and savoring it. But then also afterwards, we can reflect back on it. And so, when a theme that comes up a lot, and I've already sort of alluded to it before in some of the previous findings, that it's not about amount of time to have the impact. So this is just 30 minutes, but if you ask me, am I happy in life? Am I happy in a week? I can say, yes, I'm super satisfied. And it's like, because I have this wonderful relationship with my daughter that is cemented and cultivated and sort of treasured and, created in this 30 minutes. So just thoughtfully and intentionally spent minutes can have a big impact on how we feel about our weeks, reflecting back on our weeks, and how we feel about our lives.
So the rituals kind of have this power of scaffolding our perception of time in 3 ways. It helps us anticipate the things. And then when we're in it, it's this treasured moment. And then we remember it and look back on it, and it brings us joy. So the more things we can ritualize, it sounds like the more we can tap into this. And that gets a little bit into the next question I have. But before I do, I just want to remind the audience, please, in the comments section, post your questions. We'll be getting to those in about 15 minutes. So, or sooner if there are a lot of questions. So keep those coming. So another characteristic of human perception, and one that's been popularized in recent years, is that our brains construct stories to interpret our experiences. And even on a moment-to-moment basis, we have what neuroscientists call this interpreter in our left hemisphere that superimposes all sorts of causal connections between the things that we observe, including our own patterns of thought. And you describe how we can essentially bootstrap this property of the mind by reframing our personal and professional stories. So first, we have to identify what makes us tick, what we really care about, and then we can use that to motivate our decision making. And to help people do this, you created this exercise called the 5 whys. Can you walk us through this exercise and then how you have used it yourself?
Yeah. And that's such a lovely way to sort of frame this. So the 5 whys exercise is a way that you can sort of dig in to identify your own personal purpose. So what is that higher order overarching goal that drives you in what you do and motivates you sort of very intrinsically? And so I describe this in the work context, but you can think about it sort of even broader than that. And what's your purpose in life? And so the first, it's about answering 5 layers of why. That's why it's called the 5 whys. So if I ask you, what do you do for work? Let's put it back in the work context. It's like the first answer, and I'll use myself as an example to make this a little bit more concrete. My answer is like, well, I'm a business school professor. And it's like, well, why do you do that? Well, I do, it's important. I do research and I teach and I do administrative work. And it's like, well, why that? And it's like, well, I want to create knowledge. That's what research is. I want to disseminate knowledge. That's what teaching is. And, administrative duties are just, I have to do them. But why that? It's like, well, I want people to be smarter, but why? Well, the thing I actually care about is people being smarter about their happiness. And so my purpose in that sort of final layer of why, I'm like, my why is I want to create knowledge about what makes people happy, disseminate knowledge about what makes people happy, and make people happy around me. And so that's how I sort of bring the culture bit. So my administrative stuff that I do say yes to is if I can help students or my school or institution or those around me feel happier. And so this is really helpful for the storytelling element, but also for how you decide you're going to be spending your time and what projects you take on versus not. So for the storytelling element, and when I say storytelling, it's not like you're fibbing yourself. It's really sort of pulling out the meaning of what you're doing. And so it is helpful to understand your why, because there are going to be tasks in your work that aren't necessarily fun. But if you can identify how that fits into your why, so like, and you can even sort of reframe that activity as to how it fits in your why. So like, something I do not like doing is responding to email. I truly have an unhappy relationship with my inbox. But reframing it is like, okay, it's not email generally. It's like, all right, when I'm emailing with my research collaborators, it's like, oh, this is an email. This is about creating knowledge about what makes people happy. It responding to students, or responding to questions of like whether I'll speak on a panel or whatever. It's not email. It is in the service of disseminating knowledge about what makes people happy. And so that reframing, once you understand the why of what you're doing, it makes those tasks feel less wasteful and therefore more enjoyable. You feel greater agency, and you were talking about the importance of that, which it absolutely is, having a sense of control over what we're doing. And it makes it more fun, right? And then it also can inform, like as projects are presented to you, and if there is some discretion that you have onto what you take on or not, or it might even push you to like do something and pursue a project that might seem initially outside of your job description. But if you're like, oh, wait, that might be a step like in service towards, your personal purpose or why, that's really helpful. Another reason this is super helpful is because it allows you to define your own metric of success. And so this is something that comes into play a lot among my MBA students of like, what is success? And if it's like this general sense of like, well, what other people define it as, and this general notion, then you never feel a sense of progress. And when there's some wins along the way, you don't feel satisfaction because you're sort of like, well, what's next? Because there's always something more in this general sense of success that you can be pursuing. But once you've identified your individual purpose, it is not what other people are doing that says anything and like your relative, how you are relative to them. It is your own metric. It's like, how am I doing relative to my own goal and purpose? And that if you see a discrepancy, then that is a positive motivation because you're like, oh, I should do that. I should get on that. And then when there are wins along the way, it is so satisfying because it's like, oh, I'm doing it. I'm like fulfilling my purpose. And it's not this just sort of like at some point I will feel successful because we never feel successful, right? Because there's always more one could be doing. But using your own purpose, you can absolutely feel a sense of satisfaction and pride in your activities along the way.
So taking the time to do this exercise not only saves you time because it helps sort of triage decisions, but it makes more meaning out of your time, and it also gives you confidence. So definitely a worthwhile exercise, but the work doesn't stop there. Once we've gone through and identified the things that make us tick, that's when the real work, I would say, starts. And you provide a very useful analogy that involves golf balls. I love this analogy. I'm already starting to use it in my own life. Can you just recount what that analogy is? Because I think it can be so useful across domains.
It is, and I use it in my thinking as well. So, and it's helpful because it's sticky. So this is an analogy that highlights the importance of prioritization. So, and it's actually, it's a video that I share in the first day of class. And it's a short film, and a professor walks into his classroom and he puts a large plastic jar on the desk. And then from a bag, he sort of pulls a bunch of golf balls and pours them into the jar such they reach the very top. And he asks the students, is the jar full? And the students sort of nod their head. And then he's like, hold on a sec. And then from the bag, he pulls a bunch of pebbles and he pours them into the jar, and they sort of fill around the golf balls up to the top of the jar. And he's like, is the jar full? And the students are like, yeah, the jar is full. And then, from the bag, he pulls sort of some sand that he pours into the jar, and it fills around the golf balls and around the pebbles. And he asks the students, is the jar full? And by this point, they're like, yes, like laughing. And then he's like, and then he pulls out 2 bottles of beer, opens one, pours it over the sand and the pebbles and the golf balls. And then he takes the other and goes and sits on the front of the desk and then like takes a sip. And he explains, he's like, the jar is the time of your life. And the golf balls are all the things that really matter to you. So these are the relationships that you really care about. These are the, projects that are in line with your purpose, like your work that you so deeply care about. The pebbles are these other things that you have to do and things that you spend time on that are important in your life, like your job and, like getting a house and a car that will take you to where you need to go. The sand is everything else. The sand is all that stuff that fills in and can fill your time. Because notably, if he had put the sand in the jar first, then they're actually, all the golf balls wouldn't have fit. And that's exactly like our time. If the sand is like the never-ending inbox, the sand is the scrolling social media, the sand is like all those tasks that are requested of you that aren't needed and, you know, aren't in line with your purpose. It's just the stuff that fills our time. And if we let it fill our time, which it absolutely can and does, then we don't have time for the stuff that really matters. Those golf balls, like my golf ball, like that coffee date with my daughter, the projects that I'm doing, like writing a book. I wouldn't have had time to write the book that helps me, you know, along disseminating knowledge about what makes people happy. And then someone asked, one of the students in the class asked, they're like, well, what's up with the beer? And he's like, this shows that no matter how little time you feel, how busy and how full your schedule is, you always have time for a drink with a friend. And that's an important lesson too.
That is such a great analogy. I have so many more questions, but I should really turn it over to the audience now because there are a few questions for you. So can we get the first audience question up? This is from Kyle. Hi, Professor. Good to see you again from class of 2021. All right.
I remember you, Kyle. Hi.
Many of us watching took your class or pre-ordered your latest book. What new learning or finding from your book are you most excited about?
Oh my gosh, there is so much that I'm excited about. And having taken my class, you've been exposed to a lot of the ideas. The exciting thing about the book is that it really pulls it all together in such a way that all of us can make these decisions about how we spend our hours that sum up to a life that is absolutely fulfilling. And it is, I think the goal of the book, you know, like touching back to my initial story of that night on the train, and it's like where I was looking back on the day just feeling depleted and exhausted, and like I didn't have enough to do what I wanted to do. And now I'm still like, it's not like I'm doing less. Like I still not only have one little baby, but I have two kids that are older and I still am working. But I am now looking back and feeling on my days that it's like fulfillment. So it's not about reflecting back and feeling depleted. It's about feeling full and then energized and excited for the next day. And recognizing that it's not about how much time we have, it's how we invest that time so that we do feel fulfilled and that we spend our lives. And so something that we haven't talked quite as much about is the value of taking a broader perspective of our time, thinking actually in terms of years and our life overall instead of hours, because what that actually does is it highlights what matters to you such that it informs how you spend your hours. So one of the exercises that Kyle was subjected to and is, you know, at the face of it, might not seem all that happy, is actually really impactful. And that is writing your eulogy. So how do you want to be remembered upon your passing? And I have, and in Happier Hour, I encourage folks to do this in this exercise or assignment in the class, is thinking about, assuming you live a long life, what do you want people to say about you? And it's not actually an exercise about death, which it may initially sound. It's really about your life. And what it clarifies is, what life do you want to live? What values, what matters to you? It's like, what are those attributes that you want people to sort of describe you as? What do you ultimately want to achieve? And not in terms of like lines on your CV, but the impact that you have on the world and those around you. And what that highlights is, okay, that's the life that I want. And then that helps to inform how we spend our hours in our day. And so the title of the book, Happier Hour, might, at first glance seem sort of flippant, but it's really purposeful, because happier, it's not about turning on or off, like I'm happy or I'm not. It's actually making decisions, spending our time in ways, directing our attention, savoring those moments that we are spending that are really worthwhile, to be happier, to be more satisfied than we would have been otherwise. And then the hour is how we spend our hours sum up to our life. So thank you, Kyle, for asking. And it's so happy to hear that you're here listening.
Great. I think we have another question queued up. All right, from Rita. Hi, Cassie. Thank you for speaking with us. I'm a full-time Googler and part-time MBA student. Any advice you can share on how to feel fulfilled in both areas while taking care of your mental health?
Yes. And Rita, you are absolutely among the time poor folks of working full-time, pursuing your MBA, and a bunch of my students are in that position, and it's becomes even more important to make sure that you don't get burnt out along the way, and that, you know, at the end of your craziness of the few years that you're earning your degree, that you don't look back and have lost some really important components of yourself and of your life. And so it is about carving out, making time for, I would say, and these are some exercises in the book, to exercise. And exercise is something, and I would also further encourage you to do it outside if that's an opportunity, because being outside in nature expands your sense of awe. It itself is a mood booster. So there's an interesting research study that I was tracking using geolocation data to see where people were, and then it pinged them to see how they're feeling. And what the research showed is that people are happier outside. And yes, they are even like happier when it's linear than when it's not, in a natural setting than an urban setting. But holding, even sort of accounting for those factors, simply being outside was a mood booster. And I think, Rita, it's also really important for you to sort of remind yourself and pull back to this really core idea that it is not about the amount of time you spend in these really important ways. It's about getting the most of that time while you're spending it. And so for those relationships, like, you know, again, that example of my coffee date with my daughter, it does take some time, but it's worth that time. And it doesn't need to be a lot of time to have a really big impact. So just make sure that you're not wasting time on your on whatever your time wastes are. I don't know if you're on social media. I don't know if you are like slave to your inbox, or, you know, binging TV watching. That's actually, I know this is now extending beyond your question, but understanding the role of hedonic adaptation, that is, we get used to things over time such that they're more impactful at the beginning, and then they're less emotionally impactful over the course of the experience and repeated experiences. So watching TV, and you can see this if you did like time tracking of yourself, even in your activities and how you feel during those activities, we often see it's like, oh, watching TV, that's something I really enjoy doing. But our enjoyment is highest at the beginning, you know, third episode in, when you just sort of say yes to next episode, your enjoyment is actually way lower, but that's a lot of time that you've spent. So being mindful about not wasting the time, so that the time that you are spending is most fulfilling.
Well, we are right at time. Thank you so much, Professor Holmes. Everybody should check out her book. It came out yesterday. It's got so many exercises. It's really a fantastic guide. So thank you again.
Thank you so much.